Spectre Vision Radio.
On the 10th of January, this 1761st year, in the morning, while I was still lying in bed but awake, I was suddenly overcome by a slumber. It seemed to me then that the door opened and an old woman came in. I had a good look at her and felt assured within myself that it was my husband's late last wife. She stepped in front of my husband's sideboard, opened it, and placed so much gold and silver in it as she could hold in one hand, locked it again, placed the key on the table, and came toward me. There was a chair nearby on which she put me down. There were bruises on my arm where she had touched me while setting me down, which were visible for several days afterwards.
They claim that our eyes will just be created a slightly different from what they are. We talk, we see things are.
Here, let me rattle some papers at the beginning of the show. Welcome to Strange Familiars. How you doing, Allison?
Doing okay.
I'm excited about tonight's show. Tonight, I'm welcoming Timothy Grieve-Carlson back to the show. We had him on before for his book about Johannes Kelpius, which is called American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius. And we went to see him back, was it in September? I think
it wasn't that long ago.
In Ephrata, where he gave this talk about this early American sort of ghost poltergeist account. It's a really neat story that he collected. And as you'll hear, because he talks about it tonight, it might be the earliest American poltergeist documented.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the documentation in this story is what I found fascinating at the time. There's so many people from different perspectives talking about it in real time.
And I know you will feel similarly, as a researcher, when you see somebody else who does really good research, you kind of have to give them that nod. You're like, all right. He's a really good researcher.
He gave a fantastic presentation. It was really, really good. I mean, when someone's giving a talk and it's lasting an hour and you haven't looked at
or even thought
to look at a phone for an hour,
and with everybody in the audience,
really wrapped.
It was fantastic. So I was really happy when we were talking to him afterwards. He's like, yeah, I could come on and talk about that and some other early American sort of paranormal stuff I've dug up. I was like, yes. Yeah, so he's going to talk about that account tonight, along with two other things. He has an early example of telepathy that he's going to talk about that's, documented. And then a UFO account, which was sent to Thomas Jefferson, of all people. So it's really interesting stuff he's bringing. Again, his book on Johannes Kelpius, which is great, the most information I've ever seen on Johannes Kelpius, really difficult to find information on this guy.
Do you want to give a quick background for context as to who Johannes Kelpius is again?
Well, we did a show on him, but for those who didn't listen or need a reminder, he was a hermit, a religious hermit that came and sort of founded this society of hermits outside of Philadelphia.
Who later they have an association with the cloisters, right?
Yeah, because Conrad Beitzel came to join the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness, is what the hermits were called. He came to join them, but by the time he got here, they had already dissolved and Kelpius had died, I believe. He ends up going to Ephrata and forming the Ephrata Cloister. Tim's book is really good. I really recommend it. Once again, it's called American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius. You should be able to find it wherever you buy books. I have a link to it in the show notes. I also have a link to his Substack in there, which is timothygrievecarlson.substack.com. And then on social media, he's just at @tgrievecarlson. And again, I'll put that in the show notes for everybody. But go ahead and check out his stuff. I'm so excited for his forthcoming books. Like I said, he's just doing the kind of research that I love. And it's really neat to talk to somebody who is as excited about this stuff as I am. He's doing great stuff.
A cabal of Tims.
Before we get to that, though, I want to remind everybody, the Swamp Creature sweatshirts, the Strange Familiar Swamp Creature sweatshirts, the pre-order is up now. The pre-orders are going to close on Sunday, this coming Sunday. And at that time, I'm going to send them to the printer, and whatever's ordered is ordered. I will make maybe 1 or 2 extras in large and extra large. That's going to be about it. So if you want one of these hoodies, there's zipper hoodies with the Strange Familiars logo on the front and the swamp creature design on the back. If you want one, want to make sure you get one, you really should pre-order it. Every time we make hoodies, we have people that are disappointed. Oh, I would have gotten one of those. This is the way to get one.
And you can order whatever size. So like you're not bound to. Yeah. We've ordered people.
We have sizes available small through 5X on there. So there's a link in the show notes to get those. There's a post at strangefamiliars.com. Please, if you want one, pre-order it. That lets us know how many to make. They're kind of pricey, so we don't make that many extra. And it's not the kind of thing that we can just keep in stock. It's just it's hard to predict which sizes are going to sell, etc. So please, if you want one, pre-order it. I have the date set way far out, the shipping date.
But you'll get them sooner than
I'm pretty sure, yes. Farce Passage prints them up pretty quick. We should get them well before that time. But just because of Etsy and their shipping and stuff, I set it as far out as possible. It's very likely you'll get them well before that time.
Certainly before the holidays.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so. Cold weather's coming. Good time for hoodies. And thanks to everybody who has pre-ordered that so far. Excited to get those.
You basically do all this so you can get yourself a new t-shirt or a new sweatshirt.
Not solely for that reason, but
it's a bonus.
I wouldn't make designs I don't like. So I end up, getting a t-shirt for myself and a sweatshirt for myself. Absolutely.
I would like this design on the side of the curiosity of the week.
The arm of a sweatshirt.
Yeah, that would be nice.
We'll talk about that later. The curiosity of the week will come after we talk to Tim. All right, let's go ahead and get to my interview with Tim. Timothy Grieve-Carlson is an assistant professor of religion and philosophy at Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. He is the author of American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius from Oxford University Press, 2024. Welcome back to Strange Familiars, Tim.
Tim, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. I was really looking forward to this. First of all, people might remember you from our conversation about Johannes Kelpius, which was a great interest of mine, and once again, I think I told you at the time, having tried to do some research on Kelpius, I was extremely impressed by how much information you were able to get on him, because you kind of saved me from doing a separate Kelpius show and trying to find all the information that you found, because you kind of did the Kelpius show for me by doing the research there. So thank you.
Well, yeah, it's my pleasure. I do sort of feel like I did the Kelpius thing, hopefully, so others don't have to. Of course, I'd welcome anyone else who wants to jump down this rabbit hole with me. But yeah.
Now, do you find that research is kind of influencing things you're working on going forward?
Definitely. So the book that became American Aurora, it was sort of a freeze-dried version of like a much larger project that I had in mind, which was kind of looking at religious figures from early Pennsylvania who were like Kelpius and sort of similar to him in his radical religious context. So the other figures that I wanted to work on included another famous sort of folk saint from Berks County called Mountain Mary.
Oh, yes.
A woman named Anna Maria Jung, 18th century religious hermit, who became sort of a folk saint. I was also really interested in another radical religious figure from Berks County named George de Benville. He was an alchemist. He was sort of a medical doctor, but also a religious leader in Berks County at the time. He was a leader in the Universalist Church. And de Benville actually published a really fascinating account of his own near-death experience. So his own experience of while he was like really, really debilitatingly ill, his body died, and he published this account of his journey through the afterlife. Oh, wow. Which is just a stunning piece of work. Really, really fascinating.
See, I'm not familiar with him at all, so that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure who I need to dig into more. And I also wanted to connect this. I call it in the book environmental knowledge, sort of like a sort of contemplative and intuitive approach to a religious understanding of the cosmos and the human being's place in it. And so I wanted to look at all of these figures through that sort of religious environmental knowledge approach. And I wanted to sort of put a bow on it with Pennsylvania powwow stuff. Because, of course, growing up in Lebanon County, this has been a huge interest of mine, and I've been doing research on powwow here and there as I can. And so I wanted it to be one kind of cohesive thing. But of course, once I dug deeply enough into Kelpius, I kind of realized this guy needs his own book.
Yeah.
There's actually too much here to try to fit it all in. So yeah, it became just one book with Kelpius, which I'm really glad it worked out this way, because I still have all this other material to dig into. And of course, as you know, once the research ball gets rolling, it really tends to snowball and to sort of like sprout into different directions and take you to new places. So yeah.
I often think about powwow and about Pennsylvania almost being a microcosm of America in general. And we have this melting pot of cultures here coming to early Pennsylvania, a lot of them for religious freedom. You know, they're like, this is the place for religious freedom. And you wonder, could powwow have developed in any other state? You know, certainly not in the way it did in Pennsylvania, it seems like. It pulls from here and it pulls from there, and it definitely, you can see the Catholic roots in it, but it became very much a Protestant tradition in Pennsylvania. It's very, very interesting.
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, Tim. I don't think powwow could have blossomed the way it did in other parts of the country like it did in Pennsylvania, just because there was such a radical sort of heterodox kind of religious attitude here. There were hardly any, institutional or orthodox kind of authorities who were controlling what people could or could not do.
True.
Sometimes I tell my students this and they don't believe me, but in the 17th and early 18th centuries, Pennsylvania was one of a very small number of places where the state did not reserve the right to kill or imprison you for believing something strange.
Yeah.
So all the weirdos came here.
That's why we had very few witch trials, and those we did were unlike witch trials in other places.
Yeah, it's true. And then, I mean, it's so interesting too, like looking into the folklore that heads down the ridge of the Blue Mountain down south into what is Shenandoah. All of it is sort of like Pennsylvania German folklore, right? And of course, we have powwow stuff like deep in West Virginia, deep in Virginia, just because it all traveled on that one wagon road.
Yeah, you can find the Long Lost Friend throughout Appalachia. It's
it's cool.
So a little while back, Allison and I saw a talk you gave in Ephrata on an early American poltergeist account, which we both loved, by the way. It was a very, very nice night. It was at the Ephrata Cloister there, which, if people don't know, vaguely related to Kelpius, because Conrad, I'm drawing a blank on his name. Beisel, yeah. Conrad Beisel came over to join Kelpius, but by the time he got here, the hermits of the Wissahickon had sort of dissolved, and he made his way to Ephrata and founded the cloister. And it's a lovely place, and I think most of the original buildings are still there. I'm sure they've been repaired over the years, but it's just a wonderful document of history just to go there and look around. You can take tours or do a self-guided tour. It's an amazing historical place right there in Ephrata. But you were given a talk on this early American poltergeist case, which had Ephrata connections.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was great to have you and Allison there, by the way. So I stumbled upon this case as I was doing research just related to sort of Pennsylvania's early sort of like mystical and occult religious history. And I was looking at one of the collections of texts that were published out of Ephrata in the 18th century. This is a text that was published in 1761. Wow. And the title was An Exacting Relation of the Appearance of a Disembodied Spirit. And of course, my eyes sort of did that cartoon like boing, like, and focused on that one. And as I sort of dug into this account, I realized that we had something very, very unusual and special here. So I'll read a few passages from it, but just to give a little bit of context, this is an account that was published at Ephrata in the middle of the 18th century, as I said. It's written mostly by a woman. Her name is Eleseba Beeler. I'm going to talk a little bit about her. But just right off the bat, that's sort of unusual for us as historians to have access to a long original first-hand narrative by an early American woman at that time. Those accounts are pretty rare. So even that just makes this text sort of interesting. The other really interesting thing about this text, as you mentioned, Tim, it's a really early poltergeist account. Usually when people, if you were to Google the phrase, first American poltergeist or something like this, you would most likely get the Wizard's Clip poltergeist case from Maryland, which is actually a few decades after this. Yeah. So American history actually has a few poltergeists running around. This one seems to be the earliest. The other thing that I find really, really interesting about this case that we're going to dig into is it seems to be really, really well attested. And what I mean by this is there's a bunch of different people involved. And repeatedly, the authors of the text are saying, I understand this sounds crazy. If you don't believe me, go talk to so-and-so, go talk to so-and-so.
Mm-hmm. Should we give some background of what Ephrata was like at the time?
Yeah, this is a great idea. Yeah. So Ephrata was a religious commune, as you said, founded by Conrad Beissel in the 1730s into the 1740s. It was a monastic religious community where men and women could go and sort of live as full-time, sort of like celibate, communal, religious lives, basically. Their lives were dominated by prayer and devotional practices and other sort of like religious activities and exercises. They also had a really, really active printing press.
One of the first, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the first. And actually, in the 18th century, the only printing press that they were really in competition with at the time was Benjamin Franklin's for a while. So they were really like a major print shop in early America. They also did a lot of I would call it like community activism sort of stuff. They ran this really popular bakery. They did a whole bunch of like charity and outreach. That didn't mean that they were popular all over the place, because I should note, from the outside looking in, people considered Ephrata pretty strange. So you had celibate groups of men and women living in these communal monastic settings, and they weren't Catholic. I should note this. They were radical Protestants who were trying to sort of model themselves and model their lives after the sorts of Christian life that they saw in texts like Acts of the Apostles. So they were trying to model themselves after kind of like the earliest Christians as they understood them. And they really became like a singular and unique religious community in early America that led to a whole bunch of different sort of like strains of American religious history. So the Ephrata texts and ideas, they became influential in what eventually became Mormonism, and other kind of different radical and innovative Christian groups in early America at the time. So Ephrata was super influential. And as you said, it is a gorgeous little museum, Tim. And for anyone who is, South Central PA area, it's definitely worth a trip. It's an awesome place to go.
Yeah, if you're coming through and you have a few hours, take it, because it's just beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of background on Ephrata. I should note, so also for thinking about this text that I'm about to look into here, as I said, Ephrata was mostly celibate men and women, monks and nuns, but it was also surrounded by this wider community of people who were called householders, who were married couples who were followers of Conrad Beissel, but they did not become celibate monks and nuns. So there was this sort of insular celibate core of the Ephrata community, and then there was this wider kind of community around there. The text that we're about to look at today actually sort of involves someone who makes a transition from being a householder into the celibate community. So there's a little bit of like back and forth between these communities too. So just by way of background, this text is written by a woman named Eleseba Beeler. Eleseba is the third wife of a gentleman named Christopher Beeler. Christopher Beeler was a householder at Ephrata. His first wife, who he was married to at Ephrata, eventually makes the decision that she wants to become a nun. She wants to become a celibate member of the Ephrata community. She joins this community. Christopher eventually connects with another woman, a widow, who is also a householder at Ephrata, and they get married, and she becomes his second wife. They move down to a place called Long Marsh Run in Virginia, where Christopher actually becomes a pretty prosperous surveyor and farmer and landowner. He actually does really, really well for himself on the American frontier. Eventually, years later, his second wife dies. After a while, Christopher takes a third wife, this woman named Eleseba Beeler, and she's the author of this text that we have here, An Exacting Relation of a Disembodied Spirit. And Eleseba opens this text by saying, if there is anyone who doubts the truth of the matter and thinks that this is an old wives' tale, he ought to go to the trouble of pursuing the matter with the many eyewitnesses. For herein I call upon the testimony of my husband's children, our neighbors, people in Winchester, Virginia, and many inhabitants of Ephrata, where the affair was settled at last. So I find this passage just sort of, again, this was another thing that kind of raised my eyebrows as a historian, because if someone were making up a ghost story and putting it in print, that would be a weird paragraph to start it off with.
Absolutely.
To say, for anyone who doesn't believe me, first of all, I understand why you wouldn't believe me about this. And second, here's who I want you to go talk to, because lots of people were here for this. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yeah, check me. Go ahead and check me.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So, Eleseba starts off this account. She writes, on the 10th of January, this 1761st year, in the morning, while I was still lying in bed but awake, I was suddenly overcome by a slumber. It seemed to me then that the door opened and an old woman came in. I had a good look at her and felt assured within myself that it was my husband's late last wife. In this belief, others, whom I described her appearance to, supported me afterwards. She stepped in front of my husband's sideboard, opened it, and placed so much gold and silver in it as she could hold in one hand, locked it again, placed the key on the table, and came toward me. There was a chair nearby on which she put me down. There were bruises on my arm where she had touched me while setting me down, which were visible for several days afterwards. My husband arrived, and he wondered about me sleeping unusually long. I revealed this whole affair to him, and at the 12th hour of the day, after having removed everyone else from the house and locked the door, we both went into the kitchen to the indicated spot. My husband pulled the sideboard from the wall, and with a stick I scraped up an old rag that was held together by means of pins. To our surprise, we found a Virginia 5-pound note in it. And so, in this account, we have Eleseba falling asleep, right? Entering this sort of, whether it's ordinary sleep or some kind of hypnagogic state or trance-like state, she falls asleep, and then a woman appears to her, who she later says she was able to identify as her husband's late last wife. This woman places her physically in a chair and sort of shows her this money and gold being put into this sideboard in the kitchen. This is the beginning of a series of events that happens to Eleseba again and again, where she enters these trance-like states. This woman appears to her, and she shows her where these amounts of money are located. Sometimes, just like in this account, it's hidden somewhere in the home. Other times, it's actually buried outside. The money actually appears in these other places. Almost always, the ghost says to Eleseba specifically, this money is for my children that I've had with our shared husband while I was still alive. So there's this kind of, money plays a central role in this account. And this sort of, I almost want to say, anxiety that these spirits seem to have over the material well-being of their children who are involved. And Eleseba is sort of like the channel through which they're able to bring this money back into the possession of their children.
It's really interesting, too, because a lot of these accounts, and I'm thinking specifically, I don't know if you heard it on our show or maybe you know about it separately, do you know the Dr. Dady case?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, where he's fooling people, obviously.
Right.
But these ghosts, whether they're real apparitions or fake in the case of Dr. Dady, they never turn up this treasure, right?
Right.
But in this case, they're actually turning up money when they look for it, which is very unusual. And a lot of times you'll get these ghosts that'll say, there's treasure over here. It's never found.
Certainly. Yeah. The Dady case is fascinating. I'll have to go back and listen to what you said about it. I first came across him because I grew up in this little town called Annville, and there was actually an account of Dady doing his thing in Annville.
Wow.
Which is really fascinating. He
got
really
around.
got around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He got around.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. These accounts of, and I guess we would just call them like hucksters, right? People saying, this money is here, go get it, right? These are super common throughout early American history. And I should also note there is this sort of like religious tradition of treasure hunting, basically, in early America, right? This idea that whether it's the lost tribes of Israel or Native American groups or Spanish conquistadors, the continent has buried treasure all over it. And using these sort of like spiritual methods, things like dowsing and other sort of techniques, we can find this treasure.
Yeah.
This is a really common practice in early America.
Yeah, I'm thinking right now, just stories off the top of my head from Lancaster, York,
Yep.
and that I'm sure they're, like you said, they're all over the place. Those are the ones I just know of.
Right. Yeah. But you're right, Tim. What makes this account really interesting is, I think, at least the central role of money, right? That money is kind of like the animating thing in this whole case. And as you know, we're talking about real physical money that appears.
Yeah.
Right. Another thing that this sort of, and I might be speculating too much here, but something that this reminds me of is cases of apports.
Yes.
in poltergeist case, where in some of these poltergeist cases, we have what appear to be physical manifestations of real objects, whether it's, fruit. I know of a few cases that involve oranges, right? But one item which is fairly commonly apported, as we understand it, is like pennies or change, right? This is not uncommon, right? And so I'm connecting two things that maybe they're not precisely connected here, but this idea of a poltergeist producing money, it sounds kind of silly, but it's not unheard of.
Yeah.
In the records we have of these cases.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. And you think too, I'm assuming she didn't have a job. She was a sort of a housewife kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
How she, if you were to say she's planning the money or something, like where's she getting the money?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. And so as this case sort of continues, Eleseba continues to be sort of harassed by this spirit. And as she noted in the passage I just described, she gets these bruises on her arm where the spirit touches her. And as we see in a lot of poltergeist cases, there's a single individual, in this case Eleseba, who is sort of the focal point, and the manifestations start gradually, and then they sort of accelerate. And this focal point, this focal figure starts to get treated kind of roughly by the poltergeist.
Yeah.
This is something that happens fairly often. And this is certainly the case with Eleseba. The spirit eventually becomes somewhat violent in some ways. It throws shoes across the floor. It's sort of like physically disruptive. It can really kind of like make a ruckus in the home. Eventually, the spirit in one of these sort of trance states communicates directly to Eleseba and tells her that in order to be laid to rest, to reconcile the spirit with the afterlife and to sort of set this whole thing to rest, she writes, "The spirit told me now, namely that I should go to Ephrata in Conestoga." And the spirit actually goes on to describe this ritual that she wants Eleseba to act out. She writes, "Into the great saal above the church in the 12th hour of the night. There I should convoke two brethren, one named Conrad, the other one Nigele, my husband, and a sister who had died long ago. The ghost and Katharina," this was Christopher Beeler's first wife, "would also appear, for they had died unreconciled with each other." The ghost then actually names two hymns that it wants to be sung and gives these instructions: "Hereafter they should clasp each other's hands, and I should place my hands upon them and speak the following words, quote, 'Christ is the reconciliation for us all. May he help you and forgive you your sins and cleanse you with his blood.'" So in this passage, the ghost gives really precise ritual instructions to Eleseba for precisely how to effect this reconciliation, right? And to lay the spirit to rest. In particular, Eleseba is receiving these instructions from ostensibly the spirits of her husband's two previous wives, who are saying, in order for us to be put to rest, we need to be reconciled in the afterlife. And this can only happen through this ceremony that you're going to do at Ephrata.
Wow. Do we know, and you may have said this already, do we know Eliseba's age at this point, roughly?
That's a good question. Eleseba, I would need to double check the genealogical stuff. I don't think she's not, certainly by our standards, not a young woman. I think she's 30 or 40s at this point.
Okay, so not in that sort of like prime teenage poltergeisty age. And do we know if she had any, beyond the sort of religious education that anyone would have had at that time? Did she have any extra religious education?
That's a great question. I haven't seen any records that she did, and I would say it would be very unusual if she did, for a young woman in this Protestant context to get extensive education of any kind. I will say that just the fact that she is a competent author, this actually really sets her apart as an educated woman on the early American frontier. So she certainly had some kind of educational training, just by virtue of being a competent author. But I don't know that we can say for sure she had any religious expertise or anything like this.
If I'm remembering correctly, the pamphlet or the booklet, whatever was written, she wrote part of it and sort of handed off the second part for her son to write, right?
Yeah, her stepson. So,
gotcha.
But you're absolutely right. As the story continues, eventually they do decide to travel from Virginia to Ephrata to carry out this ceremony. During the ceremony, Eliseba's account stops, and at this point, another author starts writing. This is Joseph Beeler, her stepson, and Joseph Beeler writes, at this point, my stepmother, Eleseba, no longer had her wits about her, and I'm going to kind of take it from here.
Interesting.
So we have these multiple authors.
So are we to, and I know, the answer is who knows, but are we to take that maybe she was almost in a trance state at that point or for the ceremony? Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah, I think so. And she actually describes it when she describes the ceremony. So Joseph describes what she is saying out loud, and she is seeing things and reacting to things that no one is seeing. So when they actually undertake the ceremony, Eleseba is able to apparently notice very, very clearly when the spirits are in the room with them in ways that others can't notice. Eventually, the one sort of manifestation that occurs during the ceremony, which really disturbs a lot of the people who are present, is there's this sudden manifestation of blood on Eliseba's dress. And everyone who is present is really nervous that she's injured herself or something, or she needs help. But the other nuns and the sisters there who are there to help her kind of eventually determine she's not injured at all. And this is a really interesting manifestation because, of course, the prayer that she was instructed to use says, may he help you, forgive you of your sins, and cleanse you with his blood. So there's already been this mention of the blood of Christ in this context.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we have this appearance of blood. But at the very end of the ceremony, when the atmosphere kind of suddenly dies down in the room, everyone is sort of waiting to see what Eleseba is going to say. And then she says something like, oh, I thought you all saw that. The spirits just left the room in the form of two doves that flew out the window.
Wow.
And of course, she's the only one who sees the doves.
Wow. It reminds me very much of some of these sort of ecstatics during the Marian apparition cases as well. They're
certainly and
here, but they're also somewhere else,
Right. And talk about, the precious blood appearing in this context.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know of any case in Protestant history where the blood of Christ is appearing in such a way.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I wish we had those dresses and we could get that tested. It'd be very, very interesting because a lot of times this miraculous blood that appears, it's the same blood type, it's the same DNA, it's heart blood, it's
right.
consistent throughout these miraculous appearances. I would not be surprised if that was as well, but who can say? Who can say?
Right. That's fascinating. So yeah, for this case, I could talk about this one all night, but a few things that really stand out to me about this one. The first thing I'll just say, the sources involved in this case, and there were a few of them. I've been reading from just one of them today, but this case was written about in a few contexts. They're really, really detailed, as I said. They're kind of self-conscious of the impossible sort of nature of the events they described, right? And as I said earlier, they're really well attested, meaning they're not sort of a single person saying, hey, take this on my word, this happened to me. There's lots and lots of people involved, lots of eyewitnesses who really existed. So it's a fascinating case historically for that reason. The other thing that makes this case really interesting to me is, of course, this ceremony that we have where these spirits are being laid to rest. Today, we would sort of recognize that as a seance, right? Sure. As this sort of really, really common sort of like ritual practice in American religious history. This is 1761, and the earliest seances that take place in American history are at the end of the 1840s outside of Rochester, New York, with the Fox sisters and the beginning of the spiritualism movement. So this is, if we can call it a seance, it's easily the earliest in American history. It's a really, really like startlingly early case that has all of these similarities to what will eventually become in a lot of ways the spiritualist movement. But of course it has this really sort of severe and intense expression with these poltergeist phenomena. So yeah, just a fascinating case.
The Conrad they mention, you're not sure, but you're pretty sure that it's Beisel.
It is Beisel.
Okay.
Yeah, I would actually say I'm sure of this because Beisel, in another document, it's called the Chronicon Ephratens. It's sort of the internal history of the Ephrata community. And Beisel's colleagues actually describe him participating in this event.
Wow.
So we have two different sources that say really clearly what happened. And in this one, we get confirmation that Beisel was involved.
So interesting.
Yeah.
When you gave the talk, and I don't, if you have this passage handy, if you don't, I'll just cut it out. But it was a really interesting passage you told. They stopped at an inn or something. I believe it was in southern Lancaster County.
That's exactly
in the
right.
Buck, if I remember correctly.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So this was, I think this is, I don't know. I find this passage the most striking. So you're exactly right. While they're traveling from Virginia up to Ephrata, they get up to Lancaster, and of course, Christopher's from Ephrata. So he's back on his home turf. He knows people. They stop at this place called the Buck Inn outside of Lancaster, southern Lancaster County. And they bump into friends while they're there. They bump into people they know, and they really, really want to make it to Ephrata that night, but their friends convince them to stay. Eleseba in the text says she's nervous because the last time she delayed this trip, the ghost reacted kind of violently when they were in Virginia. So she writes, "At long last, we reached Lancaster, where my husband's oldest son caught up with us. We stopped at the Buck, and we could well have reached Ephrata that very day, had not good friends retained us and persuaded us to stay overnight there." So they get to this inn. It must have been very, very comfortable. I can only imagine what it was like traveling from Winchester, Virginia, up to Ephrata by carriage.
And even from the Buck to Ephrata in one day by horse would be quite a journey.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't like driving from Lancaster up to Ephrata right now, you know? Yeah. And so they must have been, it must have been very, very a welcome place to stay, right? Eleseba goes on, she writes, "This sufficed to make the ghost uneasy, for she tore the coat off my shoulders in front of all the people. We were so ashamed that the innkeeper provided us with a room where we could be alone." I find these few sentences like really, really kind of shocking and fascinating, but also they make me really sympathize with Eleseba in this position, right? She describes this really intense, dramatic event where her coat was sort of torn off her shoulders in the middle of this really busy inn, right? This busy pub filled with people. And she writes, "We were so ashamed," right? She must have been humiliated, right? This sudden, like, dramatic paranormal outburst happens. Everyone can see. And she writes, "The innkeeper provided them with a room," meaning what happened was so obvious and so kind of disruptive that the innkeeper gave them a place to go to be private just out of like sympathy, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of like give them a place to recover in private. in the account, Eleseba describes being handled roughly by the ghost and specifically having her clothing torn at again and again. And this is what I mean by sort of like the kind of violent sort of like poltergeist outbursts that occur in this case. This is the sort of one of the more extreme ones where it's happening in this really, really crowded room, and this innkeeper can only sort of react with sympathy.
Yeah, and it speaks to, the embarrassment might have come from the clothes being torn. It also, it's mirrored almost in these seers and these apparition cases where they're not always really proud of what's happening. A lot of times they're kind of embarrassed that this supernatural stuff is thrust upon them.
100%. Well, I really think that's the source of her embarrassment here. It's not. I don't actually think that she's describing like a sort of like modesty embarrassment. Because it's not like her clothes are being completely torn,
right.
But all of a sudden the coat is just sort of like ripped from her body in a way that everyone can see is sort of supernatural. And you're right. It does, Tim, remind me of a lot of, Joseph of Cupertino, like the famous flying saint, in all of the accounts of his levitations. People say he was often really, really embarrassed and kind of ashamed after it would happen because it made such a spectacle of him.
Yep. Padre Pio kept his stigmata covered. Always very embarrassed of it, did not want to show off.
Yeah.
It was kind of a burden, in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Yeah, I think that speaks to sort of the honesty of the case. This is not someone trying to put on a show. Look at me, I have this stuff happening. It's someone who's very embarrassed by what has happened.
The case ends up being about small amounts of money changing hands. And really, it doesn't make anyone involved look good, right? That's the other thing that really like rings true to me about this text and the case it describes is it doesn't aggrandize anyone. There's no kind of like hero who emerges from it. It ends up being this really embarrassing thing for everybody involved, which really involves small amounts of money changing hands. It's not like a heroic story or something that made anyone involved look good.
Yeah. Wow. And did you just stumble across this case in your research?
Yeah, basically. This one appears in a book by a scholar named, it's either Klaus or Carl Wust. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the book is entitled Saint Adventurers of the Virginia Frontier.
Wow.
And it's about, it's basically about Pennsylvania Germans who ended up taking this Shenandoah Road into what is now Virginia. Most of them coming from Ephrata because this was such an early period, like 1720s and 1730s. But this case is reproduced in that book as an appendix, and the original text in German is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
Wow.
So that's the book where I first found it. Yeah.
Amazing. Do you read German?
I do. Yeah. When I was working on my dissertation, I was reading German every day. I was actually just chatting with a student today about how, at that time I would stay in shape by watching German TV, but it's been quite a while. So I think, my German has reverted back to like childlike, reading skills, but we'll get there again eventually.
Oh, yeah. No, it's so interesting. I would find it because of all the German newspapers and so much newspaper research I do. I always think I really should learn it. I should really learn it.
Yeah. It's great for powwow stuff too.
Yeah,
it really
fantastic. Is. Yeah. There's a lot that it would help me in that research. Absolutely.
Yeah. I actually have another kind of like early American paranormal case if you're interested.
Absolutely.
Before we dive in, can I ask you, have you ever had a telepathic experience of any kind?
Hard. So, in the Bigfoot world, they talk of mind speak, right? So this telepathic contact from whatever. And I feel like I had an answer. This was on Pine Ridge Reservation. And I had seen the wife and it's a much longer story, but I'll distill it down to the essence. I'd seen the wife of a very famous medicine man. He had passed on. And I was collecting Bigfoot stories. I was invited there to collect Bigfoot stories. And I went into her house, and she said, "So you want to talk about Bigfoot?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You kind of look like Bigfoot," which was an interesting thing, an interesting part of the story that ties to another part. But anyway, at the end of our conversation, she said, "Have you ever seen Bigfoot?" And I said, "I don't really know." I said, I can't say yes until I see something that steps out in front of me that I can say, "Oh, that's it." I'm going to say, "No, I've seen movement, and I've seen lights, and I've seen, these other things, but nothing definite."
Right.
And she said, "Well, have you ever thought about asking him?" I said, "Asking him?" She said, "Yeah, just ask him if you can see him." And I said, "Well, I'll try it." So I think it was a couple days later, they had the whole community gathered, and they made us food. It was just a lovely time. I had a wonderful time on Pine Ridge Reservation. But they taught us how to put up a teepee in the traditional style. And we built this teepee, and they said, "Well, since you built the teepee, you can come hang out here tonight if you want in the teepee." Of course, absolutely. So we would come back at night, and earlier that day, a fellow had told me this wonderful story about he was coming down from this hill. They call them Polhuskas, these certain formations, these hill formations. And he was coming down from it, and he felt he was paced by this creature. And I was looking at that. I kind of wandered away from my friends, not 20 yards, 30 yards, not miles away from him. And I'm standing there in the dark, and I'm looking at that Polhuska, and I'm thinking, "Yeah, I'm ready to see you now. I'm ready to see you now." And at some point I realized, oh, I'm not asking. And I formed it as to a question, could I see you? Well, I forget the phrasing I did in my head. I'm not speaking out loud, or if maybe I spoke out loud quietly. And I received an answer, but it wasn't a voice in my head. And I call it heart speak. It was just "You already have." And whatever that means, now I did see something else on the reservation, which may have been a shape-shifting Bigfoot. We don't know. But when I saw, he looked like a human, but I had a dream that he took the form of a Bigfoot. But in any case, that's the closest I think I've had. And again, I didn't hear a voice in my head. I just sort of had a feeling come over me. So I called it heart speak versus, mind speak in the Bigfoot tradition.
Yeah, that's amazing, Tim. When you say heart speak, do you mean that, I guess, rather than a sort of like cognitive or thinking sort of experience, it was more of an emotional kind of knowing?
I describe it as a feeling I can translate into words. That's the closest I can come to it. Like I sort of can render that feeling into words.
Sure, beautiful. So the reason I ask, I've become really interested in telepathy and telepathic experiences following some of these cases I'm going to describe right now. Our word telepathy that we use comes to us from a Victorian British psychical researcher named Frederick Myers. Frederick Myers was sort of this major figure in British psychical research, and a lot of the kind of ideas that we consider paranormal or psi phenomena today really come to us from Frederick Myers. And Myers coins this word telepathy from two Greek words, tele, which means sort of like remote or at a distance, and pathos, which means emotion, right? And feeling. Mm-hmm. And when Frederick Myers sort of looks at the cases of what he calls telepathy, he notes one thing that they all have in common. They almost always involve really kind of like highly charged exchanges of information between people who care about each other deeply, between people who already have a sort of like emotional relationship, and they sort of are able to like think the same thing at the same time, right? So when Myers coins the term, he doesn't call it like telelogos or some other kind of word which would denote sort of like rational thought or cognition. He really says when these events happen, it almost always involves this sort of like concentrated bolt of emotion. That's really how telepathy works. And I think heart speak is actually like a beautiful way to put that. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, and of course that's sort of like your own way of describing what you experience. But where this word comes from really is like the emotional quality of these events.
Interesting.
I became really interested in the origins of telepathy because my man Johannes Kelpius actually in a 1699 letter describes what we could only sort of call a telepathic event. In a 1699 letter, that he writes actually while he's living in Pennsylvania. At one point, he's trying to describe the sort of miraculous experiences that he had among the early pietists in Germany in the late 17th century. And he's describing all of the different miraculous phenomena that he witnessed and that occurred among the early pietists. And then he says, some of these ecstatic and mystical pietists, yea, their very thoughts of the others they could tell during the time of their ecstasies, though they had never seen nor heard of the persons before. So he describes Christian mystics in these sort of like ecstatic, trance-like states who are able to sort of read the thoughts of others around them. Up until this point, we do have accounts of similar events, particularly throughout the history of Christianity, in the lives of certain saints, right? Mm-hmm. We do have accounts of saints who, for example, many people sort of related stories of Saint Francis and other great saints that they would sort of gently remind them of particular sins that they had not yet confessed, right? Or something which is like weighing on their hearts or something like this.
Again, Padre Pio, well known for that. Some people were afraid to go to confession with Padre Pio because of that. If you didn't give it all to him, he'd let you know. Yeah.
He knew.
Yeah.
And so this is actually like a pretty common thing in the history of Christianity, mm-hmm. right? With sort of analogous to telepathy, even if it's not defined in the same way. The thing about this account, which makes it really stand out to me, is it's connected to a few other accounts, which are not sort of in this sort of like ecstatic, mystical Christian context, which I'm going to describe. So Frederick Myers, when he coins the term telepathy, he's writing in the late 19th century, sort of the Victorian era. Of course, hundreds of years later than Kelpius. This is when psychical research is really coming off the ground. Just a few years after Kelpius dies, we have an account from a friend of Kelpius's friend. So one of Kelpius's close friends was an English botanist named Christopher Witt. Witt was not just a botanist, he was also kind of like an alchemist and an astrologer, and he was sort of famous throughout late 17th and early 18th century Philadelphia as a sort of like occultist and kind of like mystic philosopher, right? One of the sort of like weirdos who really filled the Philly landscape. Mm-hmm. Witt was also an expert in medicinal plants. He knew all of the different medicinal plants in the region, and he was really renowned for having extensive knowledge, not only of Philadelphia, but also the sort of like wider surrounding regions and the different sort of medicinal plants that could be found in the area. Witt was a close friend of Johannes Kelpius. They actually wrote a lot of songs and poetry together, poetry and songs that we still have. Witt outlived Kelpius by actually a few decades. So a few decades after Kelpius dies, we find another mention of Witt in the letters of a British-American naturalist named John Bartram. John Bartram is a really, really important figure in early American kind of like naturalism and science. Anyone who is in the Philly region, you can go to John Bartram's garden today. It remains this sort of like active museum. He's a really, really prominent figure. And he was also a close friend with Christopher Witt, because Witt could sort of provide him with some of these rare plants that he was interested in cataloging. And in one of the letters of John Bartram, we find a mention of Christopher Witt that I'm going to read right now. Bartram writes, "According to our friend, Dr. Witt, we friends that love one another sincerely may, by an extraordinary spirit of sympathy, not only know each other's desires, but may have a spiritual conversation at great distances from one another. Now, if this be truly so, if I love thee sincerely, and thy love and friendship be so to me, thee must have a spiritual feeling and sense of what particular sorts of things will give satisfaction, and doth not thy actions make it manifest?" So in this letter, which was actually written, I have the date here, by John Bartram in 1745, we have what I think is actually the very earliest secular description of telepathy as a kind of paranormal phenomena.
Yeah.
The very first description of telepathy, not within a sort of like ecstatic, mystical Christian context, but as this like superpower, basically, that some people have, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that Bartram attributes it to one of these close friends of Johannes Kelpius, this guy, Christopher Witt.
Yeah. This research is absolutely fascinating. Once again, I tip my hat to your research, sir. This is really cool stuff. Really cool. As someone who I love research and I love history. It's just some of the coolest stuff you're pulling up here. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It certainly sounds like they're talking about telepathy.
Yeah. And I guess the thing that sort of makes it kind of stand out to me is, again, we have this emphasis on, Bartram writes to his friend Peter Collinson, friends that love one another sincerely are able to do this, right? So the secret ingredient of telepathy is basically love, right? It's this sort of like emotional faculty and this emotional form of knowing that makes telepathy possible for Christian monastic figures all the way up through the Victorian psychical researchers, right? When they coin telepathos, right? They sort of note that these experiences are almost always kind of like profoundly emotional in quality.
Yeah, I mean, and it takes, I don't know if you've heard any of the Telepathy Tapes podcast.
I'm so embarrassed to admit I actually haven't. I know I have to.
It definitely, it's mainly these connections between mothers and their children, you know?
Yeah, right.
So that would, sort of fit within that realm. Yeah.
Tim, do you have time for one more?
Absolutely.
Cool. So the last early American text that I'll read, this one's a little bit later. This is from the early 19th century, so from 1813. I'm going to actually read a UFO report. I'm going to read an early American UFO report, which is interesting for a few reasons, because of how sort of extraordinary. So I should say, before I dive into this, the historical record is filled with UFO reports. People would be shocked if they knew how many freaky deaky UFO reports there are, and otherwise like boring history.
You get into some very interesting ones, with two in particular in American Aurora.
Yeah, and the one that
maybe comets, maybe something. They pretty much call it almost anything weird in the sky a comet at that point.
They did, yeah. It's interesting. I'm sort of the opinion there. The sky actually does have a lot of sort of like unusual natural phenomena that do take place. I'm also really of the opinion that when we're reading texts that were either written by or for early modern farmers, right? So a lot of this stuff comes from almanac literature. I really think that those people knew what the sky looked like.
And absolutely.
And this is not to say that, early American agricultural texts can never get anything wrong or anything like this. But in general, I actually do think that like rural people are pretty keen observers of the natural world.
They are.
And they know what is unusual and what is not unusual.
Yeah. Again, so many of these, early wild man cases, some of the newspapers try to portray them as like, oh, these bumpkins, and they didn't know. Who would know better what's in the woods?
Totally.
Than these folks who are working in the fields all day long. They're outside all day long. Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing bothers me more than when you hear someone try to like debunk a Bigfoot report or something to this effect by saying, well, have you ever heard like an owl or a fox scream in the middle of the night? And it's like, I'll bet these people have.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah. And was it you? I'm thinking it must have been you, and I don't know if you made the point in American Aurora or when we talked that these farmers were documenting like shooting stars and comets and stuff long before the scientists ever thought it was even possible. And they dismissed it for a long time until finally, at some point, they saw it themselves. They observed it themselves, finally.
100%. Yeah, this happens in the 19th century with meteors specifically, right? So specifically with shooting stars, and there had long been reports basically among like farmers and rural people and agricultural people that occasionally these shooting stars really do fall to Earth, and that you can sort of like see them in the sky and then they do fall to Earth. And for a while into the 19th century, so not that long ago, most scientists, first of all, did not accept the reality of the phenomena of shooting stars. And they certainly didn't accept the reality of what we would call like meteoroids, the actual object that hits the ground and stays there, right? And so for a long time, meteors and shooting stars were considered like a rural superstition.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really only until we get to the 19th century that it's eventually sort of confirmed, like, hey, some of these guys, they ain't lying.
Right.
Like,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Which I find like so fascinating to compare to like our modern things that are considered paranormal today, whether it's like UFOs or cryptids. Again, these are often associated with like rural people. Often when you read sort of like newspaper accounts about it, there's this sort of like smug kind of description of like, you know, with the Wildman reports, often the last sentence in the report will be like, our reporter is currently looking for the location of like the still that, you know, or something like this, some kind of like smug, like elite kind of like looking down their nose at these people. But as was the case with meteoroids, often, you know, rural people actually are pretty canny observers of their environments.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we're discussing, right, early America is filled with UFO reports. And not only early America, the whole historical record. This one is actually in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, the third president, of course, and author of the Declaration of Independence. The thing that makes this report being in a letter to Jefferson really interesting to me is Jefferson was really known as a sort of like rationalist, Enlightenment kind of figure. Jefferson was very, very much a person who sort of like emphasized reason and really, really wanted to sort of like eliminate superstition in what he called superstition, right, in the American population. He actually, not that many people know this, but Jefferson actually created his own version of the New Testament, where he tried to remove all of the miracles and supernatural phenomena from the Gospels to try to sort of create this image of Jesus as someone who was just a moral teacher and not like a healer or miracle worker. Spoiler alert, it's actually not very coherent when you remove this stuff from the Gospels. So Jefferson's Bible didn't really go anywhere. But he literally did this with scissors. He literally like used scissors to try to like remake the Bible into a kind of like Enlightenment, kind of like almost moralizing sort of document. So this is the kind of guy Jefferson is. He's not interested in reports of miracles or supernatural phenomena, which makes the fact that this letter was addressed to him really, really interesting, because as we read it, it's going to pretty quickly become clear the events being described are really bizarre, more bizarre than even your average UFO report. And the men who are writing to him are really sincerely asking for an explanation, because Jefferson is a man of science. He's a man of reason and rationality. He's at the cutting edge of the natural sciences and philosophy. And he's the first person that they can think of who might be able to tell them what they saw. So I'm going to read this report. As I said, it's a letter addressed to Thomas Jefferson. Anyone can find this report by simply Googling Edward Hansford and John Clark to Thomas Jefferson, July 1813. It's on the National Archives website. Super accessible. The two gentlemen who wrote the letter, Edward Hansford was a tavern owner in Portsmouth, Virginia. John Clark was a former midshipman in the United States Navy. They write this letter together. These were real gentlemen who lived, and they were also, I should note, like prominent figures. They did not write this letter anonymously. They were prominent figures both in Portsmouth, Virginia, and in the United States Navy. What I'm trying to say is this wasn't like a prank call.
Sure.
These were real people who were really asking a question. And so I'll go ahead.
Reputation hugely important at that time.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1813. I mean, they had a lot to lose by writing this letter that I'm about to read. Yeah. So they write, "We, the subscribers, most earnestly solicit that your honor will give us your opinion on the following extraordinary phenomena. On the night of the 25th, we saw in the south a ball of fire full as large as the sun at the meridian, which was frequently obscured within the space of 10 minutes by a smoke emitted from its own body, but ultimately retained its brilliancy and form during that period, but with apparent agitation. Here's where it starts to get weird. They write, it then assumed the form of a turtle, which also appeared to be much agitated, and as frequently obscured by a similar smoke. It descended obliquely into the west and raised again perpendicular to its original height, which was about 75 degrees. It then assumed the shape of a human skeleton, which was frequently obscured by smoke and as frequently descended and ascended. It then assumed the form of a Scotch Highlander, arrayed for battle and extremely agitated, and ultimately passed to the west and disappeared in its own smoke. We are, honorable sir, with sentiments of very high respect and esteem, your most obedient and very humble servants, Edward Hansford, keeper of the Washington Tavern in the town of Portsmouth, Virginia, and John L. Clark of Baltimore.
Wow. And did they say where this was seen?
I believe this was in Portsmouth, Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to double check the context of this, but I'm almost certain it's in Portsmouth. Yeah.
Yeah, that is bizarre.
So at first it starts out as, not a conventional sort of UFO report, but we have a fireball, right? Certainly not an uncommon kind of anomalous event in the sky, which is emitting something like smoke, but also kind of retaining its own luminosity, which then suddenly changes shape into three very different and very strange things in the sky. Yeah. A turtle, which they say appears very agitated. And I'm not certain what this word agitated might mean. I think that might mean that this object is quaking in the sky or moving very quickly or something like this, right? They also describe its maneuvering. So they write, it dips into the west, it descends obliquely, then it raises perpendicular. At this point, we note that it's about 75 degrees from the horizon. So they're describing the real position of an object, right? Which then turns into a human skeleton, they call it. So now we have visionary phenomena.
Right. Yeah. I'm immediately, again, thinking of Fatima or something like that, where you have this sky phenomena and then these apparition kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, the most wacky, they say it assumes the form of a Scotch Highlander arrayed for battle. So we have this other kind of visionary form. And I guess I should know, and I mean, you raised the example of Fatima. There are a lot of cases of UFO reports, particularly from Latin America, where the object seems to be sort of a humanoid shape, right? And you sort of have a humanoid in the sky who is moving around. And of course, I mean, you could also compare this to things that may or may not have been UFO phenomena, like the Flatwoods Monster or things like this, something which is both an aerial phenomena that has this sort of humanoid shape. It's ultimately just hard to know what they're describing, right? Sure, yeah. Because they're saying it assumes the form of or the shape of, right? But it's hard to know what they're describing. Again, one of the things I find interesting about this letter, as we just described, both of these men had a lot to lose in writing this letter. This was probably something that they spent a lot of time sort of wondering, do we really want to do this? Yeah. Do we want to sign our names to this thing?
Do we want to put our names on that? Yeah.
Yeah. And I also want to note their tone is painfully formal. They're almost absurdly formal. They know who they're writing to. They're writing to the former president of the United States, this really, really prominent figure in their country and in their state of Virginia. And I think they really are asking for an explanation, right? Yeah. They're saying, if anyone can sort of tell us what this was, you can, and we just want to know.
Do we know if Jefferson made a reply or anything?
There's no record of Jefferson's reply.
Okay.
So there's no letter from Jefferson in reply to these men in the Jefferson archive. He probably did not write a reply. He probably, if he read this letter, he probably read it once. He might have got as far as the part with the human skeleton, right? and then just put it down.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know. He maybe he intended to reply and just didn't get around to it. I'm sure he was a busy man.
Sure.
That's fascinating. Really, really fascinating.
Yeah, with any sort of paranormal phenomena, but up to and including UFO reports. When we think of UFO reports, we think of like things that look like spaceships, whipping around in the sky. And when you actually sort of, whether you're reading UFO reports from the 20th century or 200 years ago, when you actually like dig into the reports, they're always really weird.
Yep.
Always a little bit weirder than than you get when you skim the surface, right?
Yeah, and you wonder with this weird stuff, you could, if you were trying to be like a nuts and bolts person, say, well, a craft could look like a turtle, right?
Yeah.
But probably not like a human skeleton and a Highland warrior, right? And then you go back to, my point is always, when we're talking about these strange things, at some point, you're going to have to default to the person's description because they saw it. And you get to a point where you go, I'm either going to believe them or not. And if they say it turned into a Highland warrior, you're either going to have to go, okay, that's what they observed, or not, or like at some point, when we're talking about crazy things, you kind of have to take all the crazy that comes with it.
Yeah, and of course, the temptation or the pressure to like self-censor when people are reporting these things must be like pretty high too, right?
Yeah.
With reading any sort of like paranormal report, when you get to the really weird part, it kind of makes me wonder, if this is what they were willing to tell me, I almost wonder, like, what did they see that they're actually too embarrassed to put down in writing?
Yeah, I mean, right? I've run into it real time with witnesses. And again, talk to a Bigfoot witness. I always let them get the story out. And then I say, what else weird is happening? And a lot of times they're very confused. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what else is weird around here?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, it's like, well, my house is haunted and I saw a UFO down the way. It's like, yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about. But they're hesitant to sort of, and maybe it's a logical thing. Maybe they're just like, well, how does that relate? But in my mind, as a paranormalist, it absolutely relates. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. Let's talk about all of it. But yeah, so there's sort of, two things going on. I think there's that possible, like, I don't want to talk, I'm talking about Bigfoot, that's weird enough, I don't want to throw in the UFO and the ghost that walked up the driveway. Or just maybe the thought is like, how is it related?
Totally. Yeah. Or I mean, I'm really glad that you brought up Fatima while we were talking about this case, because I actually think, and of course not to compare this with an event which has like such tremendous religious significance for so many people, but that comparison is I think like pretty worthwhile, right? And the sorts of like visionary phenomena that people saw at Fatima, and also, as we were describing, kind of like the actual weirdness when you dig into a lot of UFO reports, right? Mm-hmm. They don't all sound like machines. They sound like, some of them seem like living things. Some of them seem like, humanoids in the air. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to track sort of the history of the UFO up to the airship and see if at some point, I guess in France they were talking about balloons before the airship stuff.
Yeah. And, the big airship waves in the United States in the 19th century, those really did predate like the widespread use of like actual like Zeppelins and
they come
airships.
right before. Yeah, they're right before. It's so interesting to me. I mean, that's the UFO phenomenon, at least from that time forward. I think it's fascinating because you get those, then we developed the Zeppelins and stuff, shortly after that. You get these Art Deco kind of saucers come in, but that kind of corresponds with a lot of sci-fi movies, and you wonder if there's an influence there. And then later on, people start seeing black triangles right before we develop the stealth fighter, which is just a black triangle in the sky, It's,
I know.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
It really is. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Tim, thanks so much for coming back to Strange Familiars. Whenever you want to come back, just let me know. But especially when you publish whatever your next book is, please come back and we'll talk again.
I'll be more than happy to, Tim. Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast. I always enjoyed talking to you.
Your book is American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius from Oxford University Press. You can get it wherever books are sold. Thanks so much again.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
Strange Familiars is brought to you by our patrons. Thank you, patrons. We could not make Strange Familiars without your help. If you like extra content and you want to help us make Strange Familiars and get extra shows besides, you can become a patron on Patreon. It's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. All of our patrons get commercial-free versions of the weekly shows, plus extra episodes. We do at least one full exclusive episode of Strange Familiars for our patrons every month. Sometimes we do more. This month we did 2. I just dropped 2 patron episodes for our patrons this week. I also did a live stream for our patrons. Our Patreon patrons, we can live stream via Patreon now. We did a live stream last Saturday. We plan on doing more of those in the future. It's another thing, another advantage of becoming a patron. For more information, go to patreon.com/strangefamiliars. Our Patreon patrons also get to participate in an ongoing paranormal experiment, which has kicked off. That's what the live stream was about. You got to hear us on site in the middle of that experiment. That's what we did. That was the live stream. So that's another advantage of being a Patreon patron. But you can be a patron via Apple Podcasts too. The program there is called Patron of the Strange, and our Apple Podcast subscribers get the commercial-free shows weekly as well as the bonus episodes monthly. Very soon we'll be activating memberships on YouTube. Now you can subscribe to the channel on YouTube. You just click that button to subscribe. That's free. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it does help us out. So even if you don't listen to the show on YouTube, please do that for us. But the YouTube memberships will activate soon, and those will get the extra episodes monthly as well. Thanks to all of our patrons, no matter where they support us. All right. One more reminder about those sweatshirts just before we get to the curiosity of the week. I just want to be a little bit loud about it because it's going to close down Sunday. I want to make sure everybody who wants one gets one. So pre-order on Etsy. The link's in the show notes, and there is a post at strangefamiliars.com about it. If you want one, please pre-order. All right. Curiosity of the week. I thought this would be, since a lot of what I was talking about with Tim, at least the other episode with Kelpius, and a good part of this episode was about Ephrata, kind of right in the middle of Pennsylvania Dutch land. Often people ask where I get story ideas, where I do research, and it's not exclusive, but one of the things I turn to is a publication from way back called The Pennsylvania Dutchman. And we do turn up copies of this here and there. This one is from 1952, September 1952. It's sort of a newsprint magazine that was, well, their own tagline says, devoted to Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture. So there's a lot of folklore in these magazines. Often they'll have ghost stories. They'll have stuff about powwow. You can hear me rattling it as I grab it to look through it. These aren't easy to come by. You can find them here and there. I tend to pick them up when I see them, usually at auctions or antique shops or whatever. In this issue, there's articles on Solly Holzbuck, the people's poet, old-time cures and beliefs. It has a New Yorker's impressions on sort of like Pennsylvania Dutch land stuff, including Dutch designs on tombstones in Kutztown, Pennsylvania.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
You know what I noticed on this? That it must have been whoever did the font, the sort of like the very German-looking font. It's obviously hand done because look at the way that.
Yeah,
that's just someone did that by hand.
Yeah, so these are just really neat sort of folk culture magazines, and they have lots of stuff in it. And there's more in it than I listed there. This is Volume 4, Number 5, September 1952. They did this monthly for a while. Mm-hmm. For a while, they were doing it, I think, bi-weekly. They were publishing.
That's a lot to put out.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a sort of a testament to how much of the Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture survives, though, that they could
into the 50s even, yeah.
Continually put out these magazines on it.
It's actually kind of amazing that every home didn't save these. Anybody that subscribed to them probably had the full run, all in order, tied in twine somewhere in their house.
Yeah. And a stack next to the coal bin, probably. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I figured I'd put one of these up. Maybe people be interested in, checking these out.
I think it's worth it for the design, the Pennsylvania Dutch sort of.
Yeah, that's what
design.
you were talking about before we got to Tim's interview. And that would be a great sleeve design on a long sleeve t-shirt. That would look really cool.
Yeah, I think you could make it your own, but do your own kind of Pennsylvania Dutch design down the side, but that would be.
For sure. So that'll be our curiosity of the week. I'll put an image of that in the show notes. If you click on that, it'll take you to our Etsy shop where you can purchase that and other curiosities of the week, those that are left. Also at Etsy, artwork, prints, and originals, including the artwork for tonight's show. My books are there. If you get them from us on Etsy, I'll sign them before we pack them up. You don't even have to ask. Strange Familiars t-shirts, patches, stickers, and more. I just made some rosaries. I hadn't made it in a long time. The antique crucifixes from France. I made 3 of those. So we have some handmade rosaries up in the shop again. I have, I think, 1 more of those crucifixes from France. They were from some nunnery, some monastery in France from the 1800s. So not many of those left. So grab them while you can. Allison has some photos and various bits of ephemera up there. And of course, we have past curiosities of the week. Some of my music is up there, including my new albums, The Sacred Heart of Hum and The Secret Heart of Hum. Go ahead and check it out. Our Etsy shop name is Lost Grave. There's links in the show notes. But if you get to Etsy and you just type in Strange Familiars, you should see our stuff come up, and then you can click on it and find our shop that way. Speaking of The Sacred Heart of Hum and The Secret Heart of Hum, those are my 2 new albums that are available in Bandcamp at stonebreath.bandcamp.com. They're also available on Etsy, but at Bandcamp, you can get the CD and the download, or the download. You can buy a digital download, but if you get the CD, the digital download comes with it. Next week, you should be getting 2 episodes of Strange Familiars. One on Monday with Monster Fuzz, and one on Halloween. So we won't have our normal Thursday show, but you will be getting 2 shows next week. So look forward to that, and better tie this up so I can go work on those. Got 2 shows to do next week. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back soon with more Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is a production of Dark Holler Arts. Intro and background music is by Stone Breath. If you want to hear more or purchase music, go to stonebreath.bandcamp.com, where you can find my 2 new albums, as I said, The Sacred Heart of Hum and The Secret Heart of Hum. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Strange Familiars, where you can join the Strange Familiars Gathering Group. We're on Instagram at Strange Familiars, one word. Please give us a follow there. For merch, go to strangefamiliars.com/merch. For everything else and links to everything we do, go to strangefamiliars.com.
Hail Mary, the midnight air.